Hello fellow Simagicians, today we'll be looking into the wheelbase settings in SimPro and giving you an in-depth guide to each parameter. Force feedback. This part is related to how strong the feedback is. The higher the number, the stronger the feedback. Pretty self-explanatory. We recommend you to use 3 to 6 Nm for road-going sports cars, 8 to 10 Nm for GT race cars and junior formulas, and 14 to 18 Nm for higher formula class. Smoothness. Smoothness is used for smoothing out all the rough edges and vibrations of the force feedback. It behaves sort of like a compressor where it cuts off the high frequencies and concentrates the mid-end. This can be used when there are excessive vibrations or feedback noises and generally smoothing out the general feedback field. Having a higher level can make the wheelbase feel smoother, but it can also filter out some details. While lowering the level is going to have more of a feedback nuances, but can also bring in unwanted vibrations and graining. However, some drivers like to have some of these vibrations and noises, as these are part of their sensory of the car. What do you think? We'll let you decide. Wheel rotation speed. As its name suggests, wheel rotation speed ties to how fast the axle is allowed to move, restricted through a damping effect, where 0 gives maximum restriction and 100 means there's no damping restriction whatsoever. Generally, a low value is going to make the movement of the wheelbase more predictable and stable, making the force feedback feels tighter overall, but can restrict your ability to make rapid and short adjustments. Where a high value will make the wheel more responsive and nimble, it can also make the feedback more twitchy and loose, and also more difficult to control. Usually for track racing, it's more often to use a lower wheel rotation speed to tighten up the beat, for better stability and consistency. But for drifting and rallying, and some esport racers like to have the wheel rotation speed up high to allow for rapid wheel corrections and better force feedback clarity. This setting is also helpful to wheelbases that are smaller in torque to feel bigger in torque and vice versa. So normally you will more use a low rotation speed for the Alpha Mini and a higher speed for the Alpha U, for example. Feedback detail. The feedback detail is very self-explanatory. It gives more feedback with a high setting. And after the 181 firmware update, we have added level 10 to 20. And this new adjustment range is a new feedback algorithm. So for 1 to 9 is the old algorithm, and 10 to 20 being the new algorithm. Higher the level, higher the feedback rate, and theoretically, more detail you get. Max torque. This setting is also very straightforward. This one limits the maximum torque output for the wheelbase. This setting can also be helpful in low smoothness settings to prevent sudden spikes of FFB torque being too high and causing slippery or injuries. It is also worth mentioning that having more torque will allow you to have a lower gain setting in-game, therefore reducing the force feedback clipping that you experience. That's why high torque wheelbases gives you more feedback detail. Mechanical damper. Mechanical damper gives a smooth resistance to the overall force feedback and adds weight to the feeling in your hands, in which is somewhat similar to the wheel rotation speed, where both gives resistance, the difference being that instead of a hard cap on the speed of the axle, making it a static resistance, the mechanical damper is a dynamic resistance that acts more like a brake to the axis, where it would gradually slow down depending on the input. The higher you set this to, the more weight you feel in your hands. Mechanical friction. Mechanical friction gives resistance to the axle, similarly to the wheel rotation speed. But instead of limiting the speed of the wheel, it gives a static resistance to the axle. Similar to a feeling when you turn the wheel on a vehicle fitted with wider and bigger tires, the wheel is naturally going to feel heavier. But the way it differs from a mechanical damper is that mechanical friction is static and won't affect how the force feedback behaves, while the mechanical damper is only active when there's feedback strain. Mechanical inertia. Mechanical inertia is a lot more straightforward. It gives extra weight on the wheel depending on the speed of the car that it's going. The faster the car goes, the more weight gets added to the axle, and a higher setting is going to amplify it further. Feedback frequency is an algorithm that calculates the feedback signal and fills in the gaps in between the two individual signals. Depending on the trend of the feedback, it also acts as a compensation for sim titles with less feedback frequencies, like Assetto Corsa and iRacing before our 360Hz force feedback support update. Having it set up high, the feedback is going to feel smoother and have slightly more complexity, but it can also wipe out some road and curbing details that you will have in the lower settings. It is worth noting that some drivers says that having a high feedback frequency settings gives them a rubbered feeling and can feel the tires better. Some rally dedicated drivers will even use the max frequency settings to get the best feel from the tires. What do you think? Before wrapping up, we would like to remind you that the feel for everyone is different, therefore the settings is entirely subjective. Mechanical spring. Mechanical spring essentially adds a stat force that automatically centers your wheel. Like having a spring pulling on your wheelbase, higher the number, stronger the force. Center damper. This setting gives an extra damping effect around the center point of the wheel. It is helpful in games that lacks feedback near the center point like Forza and Grid to have a tighter feel near the center point. The higher the number, the more damping resistant it gives. Game effects. The game effects has the same parameters as the mechanical parameters, and they have the same effects. The difference between them is that while the mechanical parameters applies to the wheelbase itself, so it's working at all times, the game parameters are applying to the telemetry data that is coming from the game. We recommend you to use this video as a guideline and experiment with different settings to find what is best suited to your needs. So until next time, keep racing, Simagicians.